This program is supported in part by a grant from the Alabama Humanities Foundation, a state program of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
The year was 1864. The sun rising over Mobile Bay was promising another hot August day. Mobilians scarcely looked up from their breakfast tables as the market house bell began to sound. As the city's other bells joined in one by one, it soon became obvious what was happening. The Yankees were attacking what from the beginning of time had been the strategic key to Mobile, Mobile Bay. Yes, sir, I grew up sailing this bay. My granddaddy was harbor master in Mobile, and his daddy was a bar pilot. Although during the war between the states, he found blockade running to be a more lucrative trade. There's a lot of stories out there. You know that the Corps of Engineers has counted 282 shipwrecks around this bay. Every one of them tells a story, and there's university professors and shrimpers and sailors and fishermen and old salts like me. All of us got stories, and some of them are even true. Stories about Mobile Bay and the way it was. It was this little puff of a plant that transformed Mobile, turning from a sleepy backwater frontier town into one of the country's grandest cities. Planters from the interior of Alabama sent their cotton to markets in France and England by the simplest method available to them. They floated it downriver to Mobile and loaded it aboard fast clipper ships. As the trade grew, merchants from the north, cotton traders from Europe, and adventurers from all over flocked to the boom town. A village of just 1,500 souls in 1820 became a city of 30,000 people by 1860. It got so fancy, people started calling it the Athens of the South.
Well, Mobile was in its golden age at that time, of course. That was the very crest of the cotton boom. Mobile was the second-ranking cotton port of the world, and it was flourishing. Everything was flourishing.
I think perhaps the best way to sum up the importance of Mobile in the antebellum period is to begin at the end by saying that as the Civil War approached, as we're in about 1860, the annual exports, in other words, the export economy of the United States, totaled $300 million. And of that $300 million, $200 million was represented by cotton.
But it didn't come easy for Mobile. Despite the forest of mass now crowding her harbor, Mobile was not a natural deep-water port.
The water level in the upper bay remained pretty steady at 11 feet, which forced the use of the Spanish River Channel. Many vessels chose not to do that, but to lay at an anchorage that's referred to on charts as lower fleet, so that these ocean traders would come into the Gulf, into the bay, anchor at lower fleet, And what that gave birth to was a tremendous lighterage trade at Mobile. And lighters being barges capable of taking cargo off vessels. And they would come down from the city and unload the vessels. And this gradually became the accepted way of loading or unloading a deep water vessel through lighters.
But pilots were still necessary to steer sailing ships into the bay. Mobile Bay pilots became a fixture. It was a good trade, and the competition for customers became fierce.
Basically, each pilot employed on his own behalf boatmen and lookouts. And they stayed down in Dauphin Island or Point Mobile, and they'd watch for ships coming over the horizon. As soon as a ship was spotted, they would put out to sea in rowboats, and they would race to the incoming ship. First one that got there, got the job. Simple as that.
Now as the competition grew, the pilots began looking for an advantage. They started getting bigger boats, sailing schooners that would allow them to tack back and forth just offshore, giving them a head start in getting to incoming ships. The next step was to build really big pilot boats and wait out over the horizon. The first Mobile Bay pilot boat built for this purpose was the Relief, built in Baltimore. It was the Relief that brought one of the first great names in the Mobile bar pilot history.
William Norval went aboard the Relief, this brand new pilot boat, as a boy, as a member of the crew, to bring her from Baltimore to Havana, which was a typical layover for a sailing vessel, and then from Havana to Mobile. And young William Norval, just, I guess, like Mobile, stayed on.
We'll hear more about William Norval, my great-granddaddy, a little later on. But in the meantime, it was Mr. Fulton's invention, the steamboat, that would add the final piece to the picture in Mobile.
Literally by 1827, you could call Mobile a steamboat-cluttered port. So we have a transition here that happens very quickly. What's going on in the world? Steamboats are coming into being. What do steamboats do well? They run well in shallow water. What's shallow? Rivers are shallow. So we have a shallow bay, shallow rivers. Steamboats are a very effective way of getting cotton down to the sea.
By this time, the river and bay were becoming crowded with boats. Racing became a problem. So much so that insurance companies refused to cover steamboats commanded by captains who had been found guilty of racing. An article in the Mobile Register in 1837 shows it was a dangerous problem.
Another steamboat accident attended by loss of life occurred in our bay yesterday. The Caroline was towed up about dusk by the Champion and the Fox in a dismal condition. One of the boilers burst about the mouth of Dog River, carrying away the forward wheelhouse, part of the upper deck, and displacing the boilers, breaking and scattering machinery, throwing down the chimneys, and laying the boat a helpless wreck upon the water. One man, the steersman Smith, was thrown into the air and fell on the upper deck, dead.
But despite such problems, the fortunes of Mobile took off. There was grand theater and high society, presidents and royalty, and the world's leading actors and actresses all visited Mobile.
The range was really enormous. There were a lot of Shakespeare plays given. And the most important players of Shakespeare came, such as people like Edwin Forrest, a great American actor, Edwin Booth, Edwin Booth's father, Junius Brutus Booth. His brother, John Wilkes Booth, as far as I know, did not play here, but Edwin Booth played a number of times.
Mobile was a very cosmopolitan city. But as British visitor Hiram Fuller wrote in 1858, it was impossible to forget where it all came from.
Mobile is a city where the people live in cotton houses and ride cotton carriages. They buy cotton, sell cotton, and think cotton. They eat cotton, drink cotton, and dream cotton. They marry cotton wives, and unto them are born cotton children.
That life, when there were planters who were on the way to Mobile to settle their accounts, and on the way back from Mobile with money, where there's money, there are gamblers, and there were many gamblers on the riverboats, and some of the stakes were high. It's probably been exaggerated in general, but there are some documented accounts of plantations changing hands over the poker tables on the riverboats.
Many visitors to the city were fascinated by the nightlife.
After dinner, we walked through the city, which abounds in oyster saloons, drinking houses, lager, beer, and wine shops, and gambling and dancing places.
Thieves of both sexes assembled to prey on the unwary. Lewd women with degraded associates drove decency to cover with abandoned talk and gestures. Boatmen, longshoremen, and sailors spent among these abandoned harlots their hard-earned savings and drank poisonous fluids which maddened brains and made them commit deeds of blood and violence.
But other visitors saw a different side. The federal government was building forts to protect the narrow entrance into Mobile Bay. The one at Point Mobile had just been completed. The growing city at the head of the bay left a lasting impression on one of the junior officers stationed at the new fort, Fort Morgan.
On the river, it resembles any business city. But as you leave the wharves and go back, you find beautiful streets of hotels, stores, and shops, all as graciously ornamented as at New York.
A few years and steps in rank later, that same junior officer would leave his mark on another large southern city. That officer's name? William Tecumseh Sherman. That other city? Atlanta. As for Mobile, well, lots of visitors liked what they saw.
When all the splendid flowers are out in their full beauty and fragrance, their odoriferous enchantments are beyond all expression. I'm told their delicious scent is so powerful that 10 miles out to sea, the air is filled with their rich perfume.
But not everybody who came to Mobile came voluntarily. Slaves were still traded at the slave market located at Royal and St. Anthony Streets. Now, if Mobile's boom was built on cotton and steamboats, it was slaves that provided the fuel. Slaves planted and chopped and picked the cotton. They hauled it to the cotton gin and rolled the bale to the steamboats. Why, they even stoked the fires on those steamboats. Now, importing slaves from Africa had been outlawed since 1808. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. In fact, the last known boatload of African slaves brought into the United States was smuggled into Mobile Bay just before the Civil War.
As close as one can come to the truth, it does seem to be that the Mayer family, which was a great steamboat family, they owned steamboats and had many interests, was a sporting family also, and in a conversation the question came up about whether it was or was not possible to bring a load of slaves into the United States in 1859.
It was my understanding from my grandparents that the Myers, along with some other people, were standing along the riverfront one day and decided to make a bet that they could bring in a cargo of Africans from Africa without being noticed by the authorities.
The Mayer's fastest ship, the Clotilde, was chosen to make the trip to Africa. There, the ship's captain, a man named Foster, purchased 130 members of an inland tribe, the Takas.
They were captured by the Dahomians. Dahomians were warriors that were primarily, that was what they did for a living. They went out and captured other smaller, more peaceful tribes and sold them into slavery.
116 of the slaves were brought back to Mobile Bay. The Africans were scared to death during the journey. It was cramped on the ship, and they had no idea what was happening to them. Since they had never seen the ocean before, it was the vast stretches of water and the unknown that made them most uneasy.
We look up and look up and look up. Nothing but sky and water. Where we come from, we do not know. Where we go, we do not know.
The flotilla sailed back into Mobile Bay on a Sunday. The ship's crew had to be very careful here. Slave trafficking was punishable by death.
They were taken off the flotilla, the schooner flotilla, and put on a steamboat. And they had to hurry and do that because the federal marshals had got wind that the flotilla was coming into Mobile Bay with a group of Africans aboard.
The Africans were scattered all around southwest Alabama. Many stayed on a plantation near Mount Vernon until the end of the war. They were then able to buy some property near Mobile. They bought it from the family that smuggled them into the area, the Mayors. On their new land, they built their own little African town. It was a place where they could preserve their old language and customs.
I think it shows basically how magnificent the human spirit is. You take a group of people uproot them from their roots and where they live, their home place, and you bring them to a totally foreign land, foreign country, foreign language. Everything is totally different for them here. But yet they were able to build huts, they built homes, they built schools, they built churches and a cemetery. They really established an entire community. And not only did those Africans survive, manage to survive, they thrived and lived and did well for themselves and passed on a legacy to future generations of people who are going to come through Africa towns and their descendants. I think it's pretty remarkable. That says a lot for those group of people, and it says a lot for this country.
Mobilians didn't know it at the time, but election night 1860 was the beginning of the end of their golden age. The Democratic candidate for president, Stephen Douglas, made his last speech of the campaign while standing on a cotton bale on the Mobile riverfront. Douglas spent election night watching election returns come over the telegraph at the Mobile Register. But that telegraph brought bad news for Douglas and for the South. Douglas was defeated by a tall, bony lawyer from Illinois. The new president-elect, Abraham Lincoln, had run on a platform to stop the spread of slavery. Down to the South's way of thinking, to stop slavery's growth would upset the balance of power. It give northern non-slave states a numerical advantage in the U.S. Congress. Almost immediately, southern states started seceding from the Union.
Mobilians were a little bit wary of secession when it was discussed. It would interrupt their business activities. It might make things better, and it might make things worse. And so there was a little feeling of uncertainty about it.
It was a commercial city, of course, a port, and the feeling in Mobile was that of a port city whose life depended upon the port. So there was not a great deal of enthusiasm for secession just before the secession took place. After it took place, then there was a complete about-face, and the city became very ardent in its support of the Confederacy.
The Alabama legislature passed an ordinance of secession on January 11, 1861. The news electrified the entire state.
I found Mobile boiling over with enthusiasm. The young merchants had dropped their ledgers and were forming and drilling companies by night and day.
Even those who had been against secession were carried away by all the excitement. The talk was of war. New songs were heard in the street, patriotic Southern songs, like the Southern Marseillaise.
Sons of the South, away to glory, 1,000 voices bid you rise.
The streets presented today a scene of excitement never before witnessed. Soldiers were preparing to follow their leaders to victory or death. The women are filled with anxiety but firm in heart, preparing those necessities for the departing loved ones which only a woman can think of in such times.
Even before the Alabama legislature voted to secede, Governor Andrew Moore issued an order that was to have a far-reaching impact. He ordered the militia to seize the 2 forts guarding the entrance to Mobile Bay.
They were impatient, you know, something had to be done, something dramatic had to be done. That was all they could find to do immediately, was go occupy the forts. Of course, the poor forts were not prepared to defend themselves. They had just corporal guards, just token occupants in the forts, and so there was no fighting.
Back in Mobile, feelings were running high against the North. Why, the Mobile City Council even changed the name of any street that had a Yankee-sounding name. Maine became Palmetto. Rhode Island was changed to Savannah. New York was renamed Elmira. Nearly everyone was caught up in the whirlwind of secession. But some, like Mobile merchant Daniel Bester, could see into the future. He wrote to his brother in Illinois.
The town is full of soldiers. John has volunteered and gone to the fort at Mobile Point. Suppose your son volunteered and they should kill each other. Who would be responsible? Oh, the wickedness of sectionalism.
Soon after the attack on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, President Lincoln issued the order that Mobile merchants had feared. He called for the blockade of all southern ports. Mobilians like Ann Quigley, who was a principal at Barton Academy, had been expecting that news.
There is the rumor of federal vessels near our coast. More troops have been ordered to Fort Morgan and Gaines. Truly, truly, we live in troublesome times.
The West Blockading Squadron of the U.S. Navy took up positions just outside Mobile Bay. The ships would remain there for more than 3 years. A young New Yorker named Charles Brother was a member of the Marine Guard on board the USS Hartford. Entries in his journal reflected the long hours of boredom.
All hands called at 3 bells. Breakfast at 6 o'clock. Weather pleasant. Had the morning and second dog watches. Pork and beans for dinner. The sloop of war Richmond came in the afternoon. She has encountered a heavy storm and lost 2 of her boats. Captain Jenkins came on board as soon as she had anchored.
With all of the South's major ports blockaded, Mobile became even more important to the Confederacy. The 2 forts at the mouth of Mobile Bay kept blockading ships out of the bay and away from Mobile. That gave swift blockade runners room in which to slip into and out of Mobile.
And once the blockade runners were able to get inside the bay, then they were protected completely from the Union blockaders.
The forts were pretty formidable in themselves, but the Confederates set about making it even tougher to sail into the bay. They put a line of obstructions across the mouth of the bay and added a field of floating mines, then called torpedoes. They left just a narrow channel right underneath the guns at Fort Morgan.
Fort Morgan was more complete than most. It was designed for 32-pounder guns. They mounted larger guns, 8-inch guns, 10-inch guns. They built water batteries, which was the most powerful battery, was built outside of the fort. It was a dirt battery built down closer to the water. That was the principal and most powerful battery.
With the Port of Mobile all but shut down to normal traffic, Mobile Bay bar pilots and steamboat captains had to find another way to make a living. Many of them turned to blockade running. Ships with names like Cuba, Gray Jacket, Red Gauntlet, and Heroine were matched against federal warships. These blockade runners were Mobile Bay's fastest ships, and legends grew up around them.
It was said of the Heroine that you shot at her bow and you missed her stern. She was so swift.
The Confederate government put priorities on bringing war goods back in through the blockade. But it was a swashbuckling business, as an early trip by the former pilot boat Alabama shows.
She was running with cotton at that time. And what did she trade her valuable cotton for in the way of war materials? Well, the list begins: claret wine, brandy in casks, coffee, cheese, sweet oil, whatever sweet oil might be, soap, soda, dry goods, nails, and last but not least, coming out of Havana, cigars.
Blockade running was lucrative, and early on it meant Mobile was well supplied. Merchant Daniel Bester continued writing to his brother in Illinois.
Prices excepting meat and coffee are as usual. Money is scarce but good. The port is blockaded, but it does no harm until we want to ship cotton.
Mobile Bay sailors knew the bay and coastline like the backs of their hands. That familiarity gave them a big edge over the northern blockaders.
We had grown used to the presence of the Federal fleet. It seemed there for the purpose of watching blockade runners, accomplishing little else because of the intricacies of our marshy coast.
The really good pilots and captains were successful despite Federal effort. Legends grew up around some of them, including my great-granddaddy William Norval. I told you about him earlier, about how he came to Mobile and became a bar pilot. But with the blockade, he was out of a job, so he made a logical switch in occupations.
William Norval just, I guess, liked Mobile, stayed on, and became one of the great blockade runners. And the interesting thing is his father continued on as a respected Baltimore shipmaster, and during the Civil War was a captain of Union transport vessels which brought Union troops to Point Mobile. So in 1863, Norval's father and Norval were competing with each other, one bringing in Union troops and one running in contraband goods.
Mobile author Augusta Evans Wilson was one of the most popular writers of her day. She had a hand in developing one of our most enduring pictures of the flamboyant blockade runner.
Rhett Butler supposedly was modeled after one of Augusta Evans Wilson's heroes, St. Elmo, in her novel. So Rhett Butler came from Mobile and writes that.
So early on, Mobile was a thorn in the side of federal military officials who were trying to keep the South bottled up.
Some people felt very strongly that Mobile was a nuisance to the United States forces, that it just ought to be checked off. And that was part of it. I think Sherman felt that way. Grant felt that way. Grant wanted to take Mobile. But they were rather busy in other places, and the government would never let them do it.
The fear of such an attack prompted Mobilians to build elaborate fortifications against attack by land.
General Joseph Johnston pronounced Mobile the best fortified city of the Confederacy. And it had the great triple line of fortifications around the west of the city, 150 guns. That was a formidable defense.
I hardly think they will attack Mobile this summer. We're preparing, and I think they will have hot work if they should attempt it.
Mobilians were constantly upgrading their defenses, both by land and by sea.
Studies revealed one of the more interesting collections of vessels, we think, that are probably on the Gulf Coast. We call these vessels the Confederate obstructions. They are located in the upper part of the bay and were sunk during the Civil War by the Confederates as obstructions to the harbor.
As the war continued, the blockade began to take a toll. Inflation ran wild in Mobile and all over the South. During the course of the war, coffee went from 75 cents a pound to $60 a pound. Butter, which cost 50 cents a pound in 1861, was up to $16 a pound by early 1865. The situation led to riots in 1863. The women of Mobile marched along Dolphin Street, taking food and clothing from the shops at gunpoint. Kate Cummins, a medical volunteer with the Army of Tennessee, wrote in her journal that the rods had an almost immediate impact.
The influential men among the non-combatants have formed a supply association to benefit the poor. They send agents to the upcountry to buy food and then sell it at cost. They also see that soldiers' families do not want for food.
Life in Mobile settled into a routine. People waited for news from faraway battlefields. And nervously watched the Yankee Navy setting outside the bay. The principal had bought an academy during the war, wrote about the strain.
It's almost impossible to do anything in school. All are so much excited. The war begins to come very near to us now. There is no thought of anything but battles. It's worse than a storm, and with the pestilence are the devastations of bloody war. So many of our young men of promise have fallen. So many are disabled, perhaps for life. At a distance, the glory of war seems dazzling. But as it approaches near, it becomes dimmed by the dark cloud of gloom and sorrow.
But life in Mobile had some degree of normalcy. Mary Horton met and fell in love with Lieutenant John Comstock. He was a young executive officer on board the Confederate gunboat Selma, which was stationed in Mobile Bay. Mary's brother was with Hood's army in Tennessee. She wrote to him about the romance and uncertainty.
He is destined to be your brother-in-law if nothing happens. Give him a place in your heart. He loves me and will make me happy if we are spared through this terrible war. We won't get married until the war is over and our affairs are more settled.
In September of 1862, a new type of ship battled her way into Mobile Bay. The new Confederate raider Florida was built to attack northern shipping. But in a blaze of gunfire, she quickly captured the imagination of the people of Mobile. Most of the crew of the newly outfitted warship had come down with yellow fever. The ship's captain, John Maffitt, decided he had to make a run into the bay. Yankee blockaders or not.
It was an act of desperation on the part of Maffitt. The captain, with practically no crew, what could he do? He had to get somewhere where he was in a friendly port and could be taken care of.
Captain Maffitt, as a ruse, ran up the English flag and headed for the Union flagship at full speed. When the Union vessels discovered the ruse, it was too late. But they went ahead and opened a murderous fire on the Florida, causing considerable damage and some casualties. Maffitt then hauled down the English colors, ran up the Confederate colors, and continued right into the bay.
The captain of the USS Oneida later wrote in his report to his superiors,
"We continued firing at him, assisted by the Winona and one of the motor schooners. But he made sail, and by his superior speed and unparalleled audacity, managed to escape us."
The Florida put in for repairs near Bon Secours. Hundreds of Mobilians made the trip across the bay to see the famous ship. While she was being repaired, the Florida was painted gray. Blockade runners had found that color was hard for Federal ships to spot, especially at night. It's believed this was the first recorded instance of a warship being painted gray, battleship gray. The color may have helped, because on a foggy night in January, the Florida slipped back out of the bay. The captains of the Oneida and another of the blockading ships were court-martialed for allowing the escape. And the Union did pay a price. The Florida went on to capture and sink a total of 37 northern merchant ships. But it was left for a former Mobilian, Admiral Raphael Sims had turned commerce raiding into a weapon of war. On board the Alabama, a ship designed to Confederate specifications and built in England, Sims became the scourge of Yankee shipping interest.
He made it impossible for a Union ship, a northern ship, to make a successful commercial voyage, that the insurance was so great that it was not possible to make a profit. He practically drove federal shipping from the seas.
With Sims in command, the Alabama would destroy 69 merchant ships over a 22-month period. But commerce raiding wasn't the only new trick the Confederate government had up its sleeve. Several new weapons were developed during the war, many right here around Mobile Bay.
There was no hope of matching the Union Navy, so they had to depend upon all kinds of wild things, among them being a helicopter, which was designed to be used here in Mobile. The plans still exist. This was to be steam-operated, a steam-operated helicopter, and it had screws on top rather than blades, had screws, so it didn't work.
But there were successes, particularly one brought over from Louisiana. When New Orleans fell to Admiral David Farragut's fleet in 1862, James McClintock, Baxter Watson, and Horace Hundley scuttled a radical new boat they'd been working on, one that could go underwater. They came to Mobile and almost immediately went to work building another submarine.
Actually, the submarine looked very much like the most modern submarines. They had hit upon the right contour of the hull and that sort of thing, but they experimented with an electric motor for it, but they just weren't advanced enough.
Nevertheless, the owners of the vessel proceeded to tow it down to Fort Morgan, where they were going to make a sortie against the blockading fleet. As they towed it towards Fort Morgan, they had the hatches open. A squall came up, and since it sat very low in the water, it filled up with water and sank.
A third submarine was built. The machinery was put in at Park and Lyons machine shop. The hull was probably built near old Seaman's vessel, near the foot of Church Street.
They cut a boiler and let a strip in, a longitudinal strip in to raise it, to give a little headroom. There was not enough room for a man to stand up in the submarine itself, but it made a little bit more room for the men who had to turn the cranks to turn the propeller.
The third submarine, named the Hundley, did sink a coal barge in the Mobile River, but she couldn't operate freely in the shallow waters of Mobile Bay, so she was moved by rail car to Charleston Harbor. The submarine's financier wrote to the designer about the move.
I am anxious about the experiment in Charleston. It's not a question of if it will succeed in blowing up an enemy vessel. That is more than possible. It is whether the success will affect a solid benefit to the Confederacy.
On the night of February 17, 1864, the Hundley sank a Federal sloop of war, the Housatonic. To be effective, the Hundley combined its radical design with an almost primitive weapon system.
They simply used a spear on the end of this pole like a harpoon, where you would drive this harpoon into the side of the vessel. The powder charge was attached to the point.
However, the Hundley was also lost in the attack. Neither the boat or any of the crew were ever found. The Confederates were also building several ironclad ships. Much of the work was done in Mobile shipyards. On a trip back to Mobile from her nursing duties with the Army of Tennessee, Kate Cummins went on board what was to become the most famous of the local ironclads.
I visited a very fine gunboat, the Tennessee, said to be one of the largest afloat. Lieutenant Jordan, one of the officers, kindly showed us all over. It is a ram and has many dark corners where the men are to be stowed away in case of battle. All looked very mysterious. I certainly felt I should not like to be one of her crew. There were a few more gunboats that were nearly completed, but we did not go on board them.
At the time, the Tennessee was the most powerful ironclad ever built. She was over 200 feet long and had 4 to 6 inches of armor plating on top of a foot of wooden shielding.
All of the Confederate vessels were very slow. The Tennessee on its best day was 6 or 7 knots. So it could not run down its opponents offshore. It could not catch the blockaders, but it was effective as a defensive weapon.
But the Tennessee was regarded by the public as a super weapon, and there was pressure to use her. So the Tennessee was pushed into service. Under command of Admiral Franklin Buchanan, she was rushed down the bay to take command of a small Confederate fleet, herself and 3 small wooden gunboats. They waited just inside the bay for the expected attack by the growing Federal fleet under command of Admiral David Farragut.
When he was making his plans to come into Mobile Bay, they nicknamed the operation Farragut's Ball. And so the question was, have you been invited to Farragut's Ball?
Farragut sent scouts and small boats in at night to find out about the rebel defenses, especially the floating minefield. He also got a first-hand look at the fort from his vantage point at the top of Sand Island Lighthouse. From there, he watched as the Tennessee arrived at Fort Morgan. That concerned him enough that he put off his planned attack until he could send for ironclads of his own. They began arriving in late July. Mr. John C. O'Connell, the second assistant engineer on board the Confederate ram Tennessee, watched the buildup from inside the bay.
On the 22nd of July, one ironclad Monitor arrived in the Yankee fleet, which produced a great deal of excitement on board on account of her heading up the main channel. We immediately had the decks cleared for action, but to our mortification, she stopped and came to anchor. About the 29th of this month, another ironclad arrived off this port. On the 28th instant, another arrived.
Farragut had 4 ironclads to go along with his 14 wooden warships. The stage was set. It was the most powerful fleet ever assembled for a single naval action. The Union fleet was equal in the weight of its guns to the combined British, French, and Spanish fleets that fought at the Battle of Trafalgar. Private Charles Brother, on board Farragut's flagship, made this journal entry on August 4th.
The report is that we are going to fight tomorrow morning. Guess we are. God grant that we may have good luck.
At 6:30 on the morning of August the 5th, the Union fleet got underway. Before setting out, Farragut had ordered his ships tied together, 2 by 2. Each sloop of war lashed to a smaller gunboat.
And he did this for 3 reasons. Number one, if one vessel got disabled, the other one could pull it through. Number two, the lighter gunboats, being on the outside, were protected from the fire of Fort Morgan. And number three, with 2 vessels lashed together, you had the same maneuverability as if you had 2 screws.
At about 10 after 7, the guns of Fort Morgan opened fire on the approaching ship. The roar quickly became deafening. It could be heard in Mobile, 30 miles to the north. Alarm bells spread the word of the attack. Frances James, who was a young girl at the time, later recalled the ringing bells creating pandemonium in the streets of Mobile.
Everybody seemed to have lost their heads. Confederate officers, of whom there seemed to be a good many, were trying to form squads of men, trying to drill them. Horsemen were galloping up and down the streets, uttering hoarse words of command that nobody seemed to pay any attention to.
In the lower bay, the Union ships were entering the channel between the torpedoes and Fort Morgan. John O'Connor watched in admiration from the deck of the Tennessee.
It was a beautiful sight to see the enemy's fleet standing towards Fort Morgan with all their colors flying. I never beheld such a sight since I was born.
As the fleet came in close to the fort, there was a terrible explosion. The first Union ironclad in line, the Tecumseh, hit a torpedo. The explosion threw the stern of the heavy ship into the air, and the ironclad sank in less than 3 minutes.
When the Tecumseh was sinking, Commander Craven and his pilot, John Collins, met at the small hatchway leading out of the pilot house down into the turret. Collins stepped back and said, "You first, sir." Craven said, "No, after you, pilot. I leave my ship last." Collins was able to go down and escape. He was rescued. Craven, however, didn't make it, and he went down together with 93 of the crew.
The sinking ship created confusion in the Federal fleet. The first wooden ship in line, the Brooklyn, stopped and began backing up. The channel was blocked by the sinking Tecumseh, and the captain now knew for certain the torpedoes worked. It was at this point of mass confusion that Admiral Davy Farragut supposedly gave his world-famous command, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." However, many authorities now doubt he ever spoke those words. As the battle had intensified, the smoke had become thick. So thick, Farragut climbed up into the rigging of his ship in order to see over it. That put Farragut at least 30 feet above the deck. The Hartford's pilot, Morgan Freeman, was perched just above Farragut. He was in the maintop with a speaking tube, allowing him to talk with the engine room. He was probably the only person close enough to hear anything Farragut said, especially over the roar of the battle.
Farragut asked Martin Freeman, "Do we have enough depth to pass the Brooklyn on her port side?" And Freeman answered, "Plenty to spare, sir," or something to that effect. And Farragut said, "Go on."
Private Charles' brother was the person on deck who was closest to Farragut. Years later, he wrote,
"I did not hear any such cry, though I was on deck and near the Admiral at the time."
Yes, there's some historical controversy as to whether he said it or didn't say it. I don't know whether he did or did not, but he certainly did disregard the torpedoes and did go full speed ahead.
There were reports from more than one ship of musket fire, which in effect were the caps, the fuses on these torpedoes striking the bottom of the ships and exploding. And the fuses exploded. The fuses which was supposed to ignite the powder in the torpedoes ignited, but the powder was apparently water-soaked.
I dashed ahead with the Hartford, and the other ships followed, their officers believing they were going to a noble death with their commander-in-chief. We steamed between the buoys where the torpedoes were. Believing from having been so long in the water they were probably innocuous, I determined to take a chance on their explosion.
As the Federal ships passed the fort, the battle got even hotter. The Tennessee and her 3 small gunboats attacked the Union ships. And of course, the guns of Fort Morgan were putting out a murderous fire.
One of the participants in the Battle of Mobile Bay described what it was like to be fired at by a big 120-pound boat. And he said, "You first see the puff of white smoke, and then you hear the report. And about that time, you see this boat coming at you, getting bigger and bigger all the time, sounding like 1,000 devils wailing." The old sailors, of course, knew that if you saw a projectile, it wouldn't hit you. It was the ones that you didn't see that you had to worry about. Of course, they didn't tell this to the young recruits, and they got a big kick out of watching them dancing around, trying to dodge these shells.
The 3 small wooden gunboats accompanying the Tennessee couldn't do much against a huge Federal fleet. The Morgan fled back to Mobile. The Gaines was run aground and burned, and the Selma was captured by the Metacomet.
When Lieutenant Pat Murphy surrendered the Selma to his pre-war friend, Lieutenant Commander Jim Jewett, commander of the Metacomet. Murphy said to Jewett, "Captain Jewett, the fortunes of war compel me to tender you my sword." And Jewett, in an informal and friendly way, said, "Pat, don't make a damn fool of yourself." He said, "I've had a bottle on ice for you for half an hour."
John O'Connell wrote that his ship, the Tennessee, was just too slow to prevent the Union ships from running into the bay.
The shot and shell fell fast on our shield without doing much damage. The enemy fleet succeeded in getting by. We tried to run into some of their ships, but could not on account of our speed. They would run by as soon as they would see us running at them.
However, Admiral Buchanan would not give up the fight. He ordered the Tennessee to pursue the entire Union fleet. When the fleet anchored 3 miles into the bay, Buchanan ordered the attack. 1 ship against 17.
The monitors and wooden vessels best adapted were ordered to attack the ram, not only with guns but with bows at full speed. Then began one of the fiercest naval combats on record.
It was the warmest place I ever got into. The enemy fought gallantly. Their ships ran into us twice without damage to us, but much to themselves.
The Tennessee's guns were creating havoc among Farragut's wooden ships and their crews.
Boy Clark had both legs taken off. He lived only a short time. Alexander lost both legs and both arms and died shortly. Very few were slightly wounded. All were killed or horribly mangled. The cockpit looked more like a slaughterhouse than anything else.
The battle was at point-blank range. The Union ships swarmed around the Tennessee.
The Hartford and the Tennessee were in contact, actually so close they couldn't fire their guns. They were muzzle to muzzle. The gun crews swore at each other, and in one case, supposedly threw a spittoon through an open gun port. And so the Battle of Mobile Bay was fought partly with spittoons.
In the end, the Tennessee steering chain and smokestack was shot away. She was unable to maneuver and was filled with smoke. The crew couldn't see. Admiral Buchanan finally gave the order that ended the greatest naval battle of the Civil War and one of the most important in history.
It ushered in the era of modern naval warfare. It forever relegated the wooden ship to museums, the wooden man of war to museums.
The Union suffered 220 casualties in the battle, the South 30. One of the Confederate dead was the executive officer on board the CSS Selma, Lieutenant John Comstock. He was a young man who was engaged to Mary Horton. Her father sent word of the loss to Mary's mother, who was staying inland with relatives.
When entering the house, I found Mary groaning in agony, the girls weeping. Never have I seen such grief in our family. Mary got the news just before I got to the house. In a letter Mary received from Lieutenant Comstock the night before the engagement, he had said that it was madness for our little Navy to go in an engagement with Federal vessels.
Within 3 weeks, the Union Army had captured all 3 of the forts guarding the entrance to Mobile Bay. Fort Morgan held out the longest, enduring a bombardment so fierce the Confederate defenders had to throw their powder into the cisterns to keep it from exploding. With the fall of the fort, Mobile Bay was under Union control, but the Federal Navy would spend another 8 months removing obstructions and torpedoes from the upper bay, trying to get at Mobile itself. 7 ships were sunk by exploding torpedoes, proving that the concept of floating mines was a good one.
The Milwaukee and the Osage were sunk in the upper bay in March of 1865. There were a number of other smaller vessels that were sunk in Mobile Bay. So Farragut was very lucky. That's the only thing you can say, that one of them did not explode onto the Hartford.
Once the channels were cleared, a huge Federal army of 45,000 men began the final push to take Mobile. the Yankees attacked forts on the eastern shore of the bay at Spanish Fort and Blakely.
Today, the enemy commenced operations by an attack on Spanish Fort, where some of our best troops under General Gibson were stationed. The firing was heavy and continuous, while the booming of heavy artillery was heard distinctly on this side, rendering us very uneasy as to the fate of our brave and gallant boys stationed in and around the fort. Being unaccustomed to such heavy firing, we were much startled and excited until we gradually became used to the sound.
Spanish Fort fell on April 8th, Blakely the next day. The same day Lee surrendered at Appomattox. From there, the Confederate Army was in full retreat, fleeing into Mobile and leaving it an open city on the 11th. The city's slaves, sensing freedom was close in hand, staged a minor uprising before the Union Army moved into Mobile the next day.
They were just adrift in the city. There were no provisions for taking care of them. And so when the Confederates withdrew, law and order just broke down. And they rampaged, they looted. But that sort of thing could be expected. I mean, they were in a very, very strange situation. And so it was bad for a few days.
On April 12th, Mobile surrendered. Mobile teenager Willie Fulton wrote to his sister, who was staying at a plantation upstate.
Last, the Confederate Army left the city before daybreak this morning, followed by all the steamboats, including the blockade runners and gunboats which brought up the rear. The garrisons of Battery Eugene and Battery Tracy escaped with the rest. About 11 o'clock, Mayor Slough, Caleb Price, and Dr. Ketchum went in a carriage with a white flag to meet the Yankees, who were landing troops at the lower toll gate on Bay Road, and to negotiate the terms of surrender.
A white flag on the mayor's carriage signaled the end of the Civil War in Mobile. Even though the port city suffered very little damage from the war, it was about to learn firsthand about Reconstruction. As for the bay, well, the war had added a lot of new wrecks down there on the bay bottom. But for Mobile, a glorious new maritime era was about to begin. Join me next time for The Way It Was, a maritime history of Mobile Bay. Part 3, Rising Tides.
Can you concern with me? Imagine what you'd see if every child had a book to read. 'Cause every kid across the nation deserves a book to read, and we can make it happen right now. No, I don't know what you've been told, but kids with books learn so much more. So the mission is for us to get a book to each and every child. So let's join hands, book people unite, unearth hidden passion. Tomorrow have a good time. Planting seeds of inspiration to motivate some magic. To change the writing on the wall, writing on the wall. One book can make a difference. One book can inspire a child. One book can be the first thing that helps to change a life. People unite.
Read to a child today and spark a lifetime of ambition.
People think I'm trash, but they're wrong. Today I'm just an aluminum can, but one day I could be a stadium.